The first thing I saw was his hand, not his face, not the room, not the lamp throwing orange light across the floorboards. His hand pressed flat against my son's chest, pinning him against the bookshelf like he was something that needed to be held in place. Samuel was 12 years old. He was wearing the grey shirt I had sewn for him with my own hands, the one with the uneven hem on the left side because I had run out of light finishing it, and that shirt was bunched up at the collar from being grabbed, and Samuel's eyes were fixed on the wall above the bookshelf with the particular emptiness of a child who has sent himself somewhere his body was not allowed to follow. I had seen that look before. I had worn it myself. Thomas Whitfield turned and saw me standing in the doorway, and what crossed his face was not shame. It was not fear. It was inconvenience. The mild, almost bored inconvenience of a man being interrupted in the middle of something he had always understood to be his right. He adjusted his trousers with one hand, and with the other he waved me away from his own door like I was a fly that had wandered in from the heat. "What is it, Cora?" he said. Not a question. A sentence that meant, you did not see what you saw, and even if you did, there is nothing on this earth you can do about it. He was right about one thing. There was nothing I could do about it that night. I pulled the door closed behind me. I stood on the other side of it with my hand still flat against the wood, and I listened to my own breathing in the dark hallway. Then I walked back through every room I had cleaned and polished and maintained for 23 years, pushed open the back door, stepped out into the Mississippi night, and I waited. I stood in the shadow of the service porch with my back against the wood and my eyes fixed on the yard, waiting. Not knowing exactly what I was waiting for except that I could not leave without seeing him come out. 12 minutes, maybe 15. I had no way to measure time except by the weight of it pressing down on my chest. The back door opened and Samuel came out. He came down the 2 porch steps slowly, head down, and crossed the yard toward the quarters without looking to either side. I moved out of the shadow and fell in behind him, 3 yards back, close enough to see him but not so close that he would hear me. I needed to see how he walked before I got any closer. The way a person walks after something like that tells you what their face is still trying to hide. Samuel walked looking at the ground. His shoulders were turned slightly inward, his arms close to his body, each step a little shorter than normal. The body of a boy trying to take up less space than he occupies, trying without knowing he is trying to become smaller than he is. I knew that walk. I had walked it myself once. When we reached the quarters door, I moved ahead and opened it for him. He went in without speaking. I followed. We stood in the dark of the room for a moment with the sound of the other workers sleeping at the far end, and I looked at my son and my son looked at me, and neither of us said anything because there were no words that fit the shape of what had happened. I put my hand against the side of his face, once quickly, the way you touch something to confirm it is real. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Just 1 second. Then he went to the cot, lay down on his stomach with his arms folded under the pillow, the way he had always slept since he was small, and went still. I stood watching him for a time I cannot measure. Then I lay down on my side of the cot and put my face into that thin excuse of a pillow, and I screamed into it. Not a scream anyone could hear. A scream that lived entirely inside the cotton and the straw and the weight of my own skull pressing down on top of it. A scream I had been holding in the bottom of my chest since the moment I pushed that door open and saw what I saw, and that came out of me now in one long, airless convulsion that shook my shoulders and made my hands fist into the cot frame hard enough that the wood dug lines into my palms. I cried the way you cry when crying is not allowed, without sound, without breath, with nothing but the shaking and the wet and the absolute animal grief of a mother who watched what was being done to her child and could not stop it, could not walk into that room, could not speak, could not take Samuel by the hand and walk him out of that house and down the road and away from that man and that land and that world, because the moment I opened my mouth, the thing that would happen next would not be justice. It would be me on the ground. It would be Samuel watching. It would be worse than what had already happened. added on top of what had already happened, which is the specific arithmetic of powerlessness that no one who has not lived inside it fully understands. That sometimes silence is not weakness, it is the only move on the board that does not make things worse for the person you are trying to protect. I lay there shaking for a long time. Samuel was still beside me. Breathing in sleep, or pretending to breathe in sleep, he had learned to do that, the way children in that place learned early because sleep was the only privacy available, and sometimes you needed the privacy even when you couldn't get the sleep. I did not reach over and touch him again. I wanted to. I wanted to pull him against me the way I had when he was small enough to fit entirely against my chest, when I could put my hand on the back of his head and feel his breathing slow until it matched mine. But he was 12. And 12-year-old boys who have just survived something unspeakable do not always want to be touched, even by their mothers, especially by their mothers, because tenderness can break open the thing they are working hard to keep sealed. So I lay next to him without touching him, and I listened to his breathing, and I cried without sound until there was nothing left. And then I lay in the empty after it, staring at the ceiling with my palms still marked from the cot frame, thinking about Thomas Whitfield sleeping easy in his house 50 yards away. 50 yards. That was the entire distance between what he was and what I was. 50 yards of Mississippi night and a property line built entirely to protect him from consequences and to deny them to me. He would wake tomorrow and eat the breakfast I cooked. He would sit at the head of his table and drink the coffee I poured, and look out at the land that other people's bodies had built and feel, in all probability, nothing in particular. He had felt nothing in particular tonight. I had seen it in his face, the inconvenience, the mild irritation, the wave of the hand. Not the face of a man who understood he had done something. The face of a man who had done something so many times, in such complete safety, that the concept of it being something did not exist anywhere in his understanding of the world. I could not call the law. There was no law that saw what I saw. I could not go to the church that told us to endure, that had been used as a tool of exactly this kind of endurance for exactly this kind of crime for as long as I had been alive. I could not go to any white person in that county and speak Samuel's name in the same sentence as Thomas Whitfield's and expect anything other than punishment for the speaking. I could not run. Where would I run in Mississippi in 1851 with a 12-year-old boy? No papers, no money, no road that led somewhere safe. I could not fight openly without leaving Samuel without a mother in a place where a motherless black child had no floor beneath him at all. I had nothing. That was the truth of it, lying in that cot in the dark. I had nothing, and Thomas Whitfield had everything. And between those two facts sat my son breathing 3 feet away from me, and the entire architecture of the world I lived inside had been built specifically to ensure that gap never closed. And that was when something in me that had been hot went cold. Not the cold of giving up. Something different. A cold that is not the absence of fire, but fire compressed down into itself. Fire that has stopped needing to be loud because it has found its direction. I had seen my mother Isis get cold like that once, when the overseer had destroyed her herb garden in a sweep of what he called cleaning up, raking her life's work into a pile and setting it alight while she stood watching with a face so still and so quiet that even he had felt something change in the air around him without knowing what it was. 3 months later, that overseer had left the property with an illness no doctor in the county could explain. Isis never said a word about it. She didn't need to. I let the cold settle into me. I let it find its shape. By the time the sky outside began to go from black to the deep blue that comes before the grey that comes before the light, I had stopped crying, and I had stopped shaking, and I had stopped feeling the particular helplessness of a woman with no options. Because I did have one option. I had always had one option. I had been carrying it in my head since I was a girl watching Isis in the summer heat, learning what soil gives and what it keeps, and what it does to the body of a man who consumes what it keeps without knowing what he is consuming. I was going to kill Thomas Whitfield, and I was going to do it with my hands, my knowledge, and the food he had been eating out of my kitchen for 23 years without ever once asking himself what I was capable of. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow I was going to start. My mother's name was Isis. She came from the Ivory Coast on a ship that she described to me only once, in pieces, in the kind of language that people use when they are translating an experience that exists in the body and not in words. She was 16 years old when that ship left the West African coast, and she was a different person entirely by the time it arrived. Not because she had changed, but because the crossing had stripped away everything she had been inside of. The village, the language spoken aloud every day, the faces of people who had known her since birth, and deposited her into a world that required her to rebuild herself from the inside out, using only what she had managed to carry in her head. What Isis carried in her head was considerable. She had grown up learning from the women in her village who understood plants and soil and the processes that happen in the dark, not in any mystical sense, not in the sense that plantation owners would later use to dismiss and distort what African women knew, but in the straightforward empirical sense of knowledge accumulated across generations of careful observation. What happens to organic matter when it decomposes in soil that receives no sunlight? What processes take place in the absence of oxygen, and what those processes leave behind in the surrounding tissue? How the human body responds when it ingests what those processes produce. A body that has no name for what is entering it, no defense prepared, no physician in 1851 who has the tools to identify what is happening before it is already too late to stop it. Isis taught me these things the way she taught me to cook. By doing them together, by explaining as she went, by asking me what I noticed, and waiting for me to arrive at the answer rather than handing it to me. She never told me these things would be useful in any specific way. Knowledge does not need a predetermined destination to be worth carrying. You carry it because it belongs to you, and in the life we were living, almost nothing else did. She died in 1839 from a fever that lasted 6 days. I buried her under the sweet gum tree at the edge of the quarters and stood over the fresh dirt for a long time with Samuel on my hip, 14 months old and too young to understand anything except that something in the way I was standing was different from how I usually stood, which made him go quiet in the way that babies go quiet when they sense something in the adult body beside them that they have no words for yet. I told him that his grandmother was in the ground and in the tree and in the air, and that she had left us everything she knew, which was more than most people leave. He looked at me with his large eyes and put his head against my shoulder. I carried him back to the quarters, and that was all the ceremony there was room for. 12 years later, lying in the dark with my palms marked from the cot frame, I understood for the first time in a clear and specific way exactly what Isis had left us. She had left us this. I want to be precise about what I did and did not do, because this story has been wrong in every version approached from the outside by people who needed it to be something other than what it was. It was not magic. It was not conjuring. It was not the particular fiction that white Southerners constructed about African women and dark rituals, because that fiction made what we knew seem supernatural and therefore easier to fear in the wrong direction. The theatrical direction. The direction that keeps you looking at the wrong thing entirely. What I did was apply knowledge about decomposition to a practical problem, using materials available to me in the environment I occupied. I did not have the scientific vocabulary for it in 1851. Neither did Harlan Moore, the physician who spent 2 weeks trying to diagnose what I had done and who wrote in his notebooks that he was looking at one of the most confounding clinical presentations of his 22 years in practice. The vocabulary came later. What I understood came from Isis, and Isis understood it from the women before her. And those women had been observing and accumulating and passing forward for longer than any of the books in Thomas Whitfield's library had existed. What I needed was behind the old equipment shed on the eastern side of the property, a stretch of ground that sat in full shadow all day because two large live oaks had grown too close together, their canopies merging overhead and blocking the sun from the soil below. Ground that never fully dried, ground that accumulated moisture and organic matter, and the particular decay that happens when there is no oxygen moving through the soil, the slow, thorough, invisible work that produces compounds in the surrounding decomposed tissue that a human body in 1851 has no preparation to survive once they enter the bloodstream. The fever comes first, within 2 to 4 days of ingestion. Then the body-wide inflammation. Then, in the worst cases, the lesions, wounds that open from beneath the skin outward, not from any visible injury, but from infection reaching the dermis and breaking it down from the inside. A physician looking at those lesions in 1851 would have no framework to explain their origin. He would try everything he knew. None of it would work. I had seen Isis observe this process in animals. I had observed it myself over years. I had never applied it deliberately to a human being, and I want to say clearly that I thought about that. That in the months between June and October of 1851, I turned it over many times, examining it from every angle that a person examines something they know they are going to do but need to understand fully before they do it. I had no other recourse. I want that understood not as an excuse but as a fact of the world I was living inside. In Mississippi in 1851, an enslaved woman who accused a white plantation owner of abusing her child had no mechanism of justice available to her. Not in any court, not in any church, not in any conversation with any white person in that county who had the power to act. Thomas Whitfield himself clearly did not recognize he had done something that required accounting for. The evidence of that was in his face when he turned and saw me in that doorway and felt nothing that resembled alarm. Now I need to tell you about Samuel in those 4 months, because he does not disappear from this story just because I have not mentioned him. He was there every day. He was there in the kitchen in the mornings when I lit the stove, quieter than he had been before June, with a way of moving through rooms that had changed. A new carefulness, a new attention to where the doors were and who was near them. He still did his work. He still answered when spoken to. But the particular ease that children carry in their bodies before the world takes it from them. The ease of a boy who has not yet learned to measure every room he enters. That was gone. I watched it be gone every day, and I cooked Thomas Whitfield's breakfast every morning, and I carried what I was planning in the part of myself that I had learned long ago to keep completely separate from my face. There were moments when Samuel looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not questioning exactly, more like watching. Like he was trying to figure out what I was doing beneath what I was visibly doing. He was a careful observer, Samuel. He had learned that early, the same way I had, because when you belong to other people, observation is one of the few tools of understanding that no one can take from you. I never told him what I was planning. There are things a mother keeps from a child, not because the child couldn't understand, but because the understanding would place a weight on him that belongs to her, alone to carry. I heard about the mayor on a Tuesday morning in July, 3 weeks after the night in the hallway. The foreman's voice in the stable yard before sunrise. "Dead. The filly came dead," said the way a man says a fence needs mending. The dead filly was dragged out of the stable in the direction of the eastern side of the property. I heard the sound of it from the kitchen window, and I noted it the way Isis had taught me to note anything that would be used. Without reaction, without urgency, the way you file a fact in the part of your mind reserved for facts that will matter later. I waited until midday when the heat drove everyone to shade and the eastern side of the property emptied out. I took the bucket I used every day to carry kitchen scraps to the composting pile. No one ever questioned a woman with that bucket on that path. I had made that walk hundreds of times. And I went around to the back of the equipment shed. On the way, I stopped at the woodpile and loaded a few split pieces into the bucket, along with some loose straw from beside the stable door. That was what I always did on that path when I wasn't carrying scraps. Collect small things that had fallen, tidy as I went. Anyone watching would see exactly what they expected to see. The dead filly was where I knew it would be. The placenta had come with it and was lying in the wet, dark soil beside the body, already beginning to separate at the edges in the July heat. I stood there and I looked at it. Not with hesitation. The hesitation had finished in the cot on the night of June. I looked at it the way Isis had taught me to look at anything I was going to work with, fully, without letting the eye slide away from what the eye wants to slide away from. Registering the colour, the smell, the texture, the exact stage of what was beginning to happen in that soil. I did not take anything that day. It was too early. The process needed more weeks in that specific ground, in that specific shadow, to produce what I needed it to produce. I walked back to the kitchen with the bucket carrying its wood and straw and continued the day the same as every other day. I went back every week, always with the bucket. Always at midday, always collecting something small and unremarkable on the way. A rusted nail, a handful of dry leaves, a piece of broken tool handle from beside the shed, so that the bucket was never obviously empty, going out or coming back, so that the walk had the texture of routine maintenance and nothing more. I watched the process in that dark soil move through its stages with the patience of someone who has accepted that the work requires exactly the time it requires, and not one day less. When I judged the stage to be correct, and I knew what correct looked like because Isis had shown me what to look for, and I had been looking for it carefully for weeks, I took what I needed, placed it in the bucket beneath a wet kitchen cloth, and carried it back along the same path I had walked hundreds of times, looking exactly like Cora doing what Cora always did. No one watched. No one ever watched Cora closely enough for it to matter. I worked with the preparation in the hours between the end of dinner service and the beginning of the next morning, in the stretch of time that was mine, in the sense that no one was actively monitoring it, though nothing in that place was ever truly mine. The work had to be done in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed, which meant I had to be careful about smell, careful about what remained visible, careful about every intermediate stage of the preparation that could not be allowed to persist beyond its usefulness. Anything that didn't need to exist past the night I was working, I burned in the stove. The ash from cooking was ordinary. No one examined the ash from Cora's stove. The final preparation needed to look and behave like rendered cooking fat, the kind I used every week in that kitchen, the kind Thomas Whitfield had eaten in my food for 23 years without once thinking about what his food was made of, or who had made it, or what that person knew. It needed to integrate into a larger dish without altering the smell or taste in a way that men who had been drinking bourbon for 2 hours before sitting down to eat would detect. Achieving that balance took the full span of August and September, testing the preparation in small stages, adjusting, beginning again, destroying every trial before it could become evidence. By the end of September, I had what I needed, and I knew it was what I needed because Isis had taught me what ready looked like, and it looked like this. Dorothea Whitfield did not eat at the birthday dinner. She had one of her headaches that evening, the headaches that had kept her at a careful distance from Thomas's social life for most of their marriage, and spent the night in the front parlour, receiving the wives of the guests. This was not something I planned. It was simply the way things arranged themselves. Dorothea ate my food every other day of her life in that house, and she never showed any sign of illness beyond the headaches she had always had. And I want that to be clear because the question of whether I would have harmed her is one I have asked myself. I did not plan to. I planned the dinner, and Dorothea removed herself from the dinner of her own circumstances, and I have let that arrangement stand without examining it too closely because some questions, once you start pulling at them, require more honesty than is comfortable to produce. Thomas's birthday dinner was on the 15th of October, 1851. He was turning 46. 11 guests, plus Thomas. The attorney from Natchez, Callaway. The merchant from Vicksburg, Prentice, 3 neighbouring plantation owners, Burwell from the Sunflower County property to the north, 2 others whose names appear in Moore's notebooks, and Harlan Moore himself, who was as much a social fixture in Thomas's life as a professional one, a childhood friend who had hunted with him and drunk with him, and had the kind of friendship built on proximity and shared assumptions that men of that class in that place maintained easily because they never needed to question its foundations. I sent the 2 women who usually helped me in the kitchen to serve drinks on the veranda and assist in the parlour. I was alone in the kitchen for approximately 3 hours before service. The main dish was pork. It was always pork at the Whitfield table for formal events, and I had been preparing it for 23 years. I knew exactly how it was supposed to look, how it was supposed to smell, how the sauce should sit in the lamplight of the dining room. I built it correctly, as I always did, with the additional preparation incorporated into the cooking fat in the early stages, distributed throughout the dish in a way that no eye or nose or tongue would identify, particularly at a table full of men who had been drinking since late afternoon. I cracked the kitchen door during the main course, as I always did at formal dinners, to manage the timing of service. Thomas was at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair, laughing at something Prentice had said. He looked entirely well. He looked like a man with no reason to believe that anything in his life would change. I pulled the kitchen door closed and went back to work. I also need to tell you about the decision to include the quarters workers in the contamination, because it was a deliberate decision, and it is the one that sits heaviest in me even now. I served the remaining preparation mixed into the workers' food the following day. The concentration was significantly lower than what went to the dinner table, enough to cause several days of fever and illness, not the severe progression I had prepared for Thomas and his guests. I needed the illness pattern to extend beyond the dining room. A contamination event affecting only the white dinner guests pointed directly at the kitchen and the person running it. A contamination event that also reached the quarters pointed at the food supply, the sourcing from Vicksburg, the summer heat, the water, a dozen explanations that a physician of that era would work through methodically before arriving anywhere near the woman who had been invisibly running that kitchen for 23 years. Several workers became sick. I knew each of their names. I cooked for them when they couldn't cook for themselves, and I sat with 2 of them through the worst nights. I have turned that decision over more times than I have turned over Thomas Whitfield's death, and I have not arrived at a clean resolution of it. What I arrived at is this. I chose between options that were all costly and all imperfect, and I chose the one that protected Samuel and ended Thomas Whitfield, and gave Harlan Moore enough noise in his investigation to keep him from ever standing in a courtroom with certainty. I am not asking for absolution. I am telling you what happened. The first reports of illness reached the Whitfield house on the 18th of October. Prentice sent word from Vicksburg that he had been confined to bed since his return with a fever his physician could not account for. By the 20th, 2 of the plantation neighbours had sent similar reports. On the 21st, Dorothea found Thomas at his desk in the early morning looking pale and disoriented, his hands trembling around his coffee cup, and she sent for Harlan Moore. Thomas spent the first week believing it was a passing illness. He had been healthy his entire life and had no framework for understanding that a body can turn against itself regardless of will or status or how the world has always arranged itself around you. He kept trying to get up and attend to the plantation business, and Moore kept directing him back to bed with the firm patience of a physician managing a patient who has not yet accepted the seriousness of his situation. By the end of the second week, Thomas had accepted the seriousness of his situation. The lesions began on the 27th. A redness along his left forearm that he attributed to a scratch he didn't remember getting. A discoloration at the base of his neck. By the 30th they had opened. Not cleanly, not from any visible wound, but from beneath the skin spreading outward. Harlan Moore examined them with the expression of a man looking at something his training has not prepared him for. working very hard not to let that show. He cleaned and dressed the wounds and wrote in his notebook that the presentation was unlike anything he had encountered in 2 decades of practice. He came to the kitchen on the 30th. He was a tall man with a grey moustache and the large, steady hands of a physician, and he had eyes that registered things quickly. The most significant feature of his presence, the detail I noted immediately and tracked throughout every conversation we had. He was not a stupid man. He was not a careless investigator. He was a man operating at the absolute limit of what his era's knowledge could offer him, looking directly at what had happened without the conceptual framework to see it clearly. That gap between his perception and his comprehension was the only space I needed. "You prepared the dinner on the 15th, he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir," I said, and did not stop what I was doing. "Where was the pork sourced?" "Mr. Whitfield orders from Vicksburg, doctor. I work with what gets sent." "Did anyone else eat from the same preparation, outside the dinner guests?" I paused the way a person pauses when genuinely thinking, which is different from the pause of someone deciding how much truth to offer, and the difference is small enough that you have to be watching carefully to read it. Moore was watching carefully enough that I made sure it was the former. "I served the leftovers to the quarters the next day like I always do after a big dinner. Some of those people got sick too, doctor. I thought you already knew about that." He had known. It was in his notebooks. The extension of the illness into the quarters had done exactly what I needed it to. Spread his investigative attention across a wider field, given him more directions to look in than the dinner table alone. "Did you eat yourself?" he asked. "No, sir. I don't eat before service is done, and by the time service is done at a dinner like that, there's not much left." That was true. I had made it true. Moore looked around the kitchen, at the shelves, the hanging herbs, the pots, the surfaces. There was nothing to find. The kitchen was exactly a kitchen. The herbs on their hooks were rosemary, thyme, bay laurel, sage, everything sourced visibly and normally in the weeks preceding the dinner. The preparation itself had not been in that kitchen since the night of the 15th. Every intermediate stage had been burned. Every trace had been made into ash, and the ash had become ordinary ash from an ordinary cooking fire. "If you think of anything unusual about that evening's preparation," he said, pausing at the door without turning back, "let me know." "Yes, sir," I said. He left. I heard his footsteps down the hallway and I continued working. But I registered the quality of that pause, the pause of a man who believes he has left something behind in a room he is walking out of and does not yet know what it is. Thomas continued to deteriorate through November. The fever that had seemed to ease in the 3rd week returned in the 4th with greater force. The lesions spread. He stopped managing solid food. Moore tried every treatment the medicine of his time offered. The bleedings, the poultices, the preparations that 19th century physicians administered with more confidence than the outcomes ever justified, and watched each of them fail to alter what was moving through Thomas Whitfield's body. Thomas began speaking in a disordered way by the middle of the 2nd week of November. There were periods of clarity between the confusion, and in those periods he was frightened in a way I had not seen in him before. A genuine animal fear, the fear of a body that understands it is losing a contest it cannot comprehend. He called his father's name. He called Dorothea. Dorothea visited in short intervals, standing near the door with her hands folded, her face arranged in a managed concern that was real but held at the same careful distance she had maintained in that marriage for years. Moore came back a 2nd time in the 3rd week of November, 3 days before Thomas died. I knew he was coming. I heard his horse in the yard and felt the particular quality of alertness that had lived in my chest since October sharpen into something more focused. This visit was different from the first. He had been thinking for 3 weeks. He had visited the other sick men. He had filled more pages in his notebooks and arrived at the end of what his knowledge could produce, and was now returning to the place where his instinct had been pointing him, since the first visit. He came to the kitchen again. This time he did not ask about the pork saucing. He asked about my mother. "I'm told you were taught to cook by your mother," he said. "That she came from West Africa?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Did she teach you anything beyond cooking? About plants? About the land here?" I looked at him directly for the first time in either of our conversations. Not long, not with any particular expression, just enough to let him see that I understood exactly what he was asking and that I was choosing how to answer it with full awareness of what the answer would mean. "She taught me to cook, Doctor," I said. "That's all I know how to do." He held my gaze for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the November yard was grey and still, and Samuel was crossing it toward the stable with a bucket of feed, his head down, that careful walk he had been walking since June. Moore looked at Samuel through the window, then he looked back at me. Then he looked down at his hands. He left without asking another question. I watched him mount his horse in the yard, and I watched him ride down the road, and I noted, with the same careful attention I had given everything in those 4 months, that this time he did not look back. The first time he had paused at the door. The second time he had asked about Isis. This time he rode away without turning, without hesitating, without any of the gestures of a man who is still searching. He rode away like a man who has found what he was looking for and made a decision about what to do with it. His decision was silence. I understood that silence the moment I saw him ride past the tree line without looking back, and I understood what it meant, not absolution, not complicity exactly, but the particular silence of a man who has looked at the full shape of something and concluded that the justice of naming it does not outweigh the weight of what naming it would require him to ignore. He had seen Samuel cross that yard. He had seen my face when I told him my mother taught me to cook and nothing else. He had put those two things together with everything else he had assembled in 3 weeks of investigation, and he had made his choice. I turned back to the stove. I finished the day. I did not allow myself to feel the relief of it until I was alone that night with the fire burned down to coals, and even then I held it carefully, the way you hold something that has cost too much to celebrate. Thomas died on the morning of Thursday, November 13th. I was in the corner chair when his breathing changed its rhythm and then stopped. I sat in the silence for a few minutes before I got up, walked to the window, and called for the housemaid to go and wake Dorothea. 4 men died from what happened at that dinner table. Thomas, Calloway the attorney, Burwell from the Sunflower County property, and Prentice the Vicksburg merchant. The others survived, some with months of persistent weakness and wounds that would not close in normal time. Moore spent over a year visiting the surviving cases and filling notebooks with theories that circled the truth without ever landing on it, because landing on it required a framework that medicine would not develop for another generation. He never presented a formal conclusion. His notebooks, auctioned as part of a family estate sale in Natchez in 1923, contained as their final entry on the Whitfield case a single sentence that has been quoted by the small number of historians who have examined the episode. There is an explanation for what happened in that house. It is not mine to possess. Dorothea Whitfield sold the plantation in 1853 and moved to Memphis to live with her sister. The enslaved people on the property were transferred with the sale, as property transferred. I was assessed at $400 in the sale documents. Experienced cook, docile temperament, no history of difficulty. Samuel was assessed at $250. We were purchased together by a farmer named Prescott, whose character the available records suggest was defined primarily by indifference, not cruelty for its own sake, not the particular repetitive cruelty of Thomas Whitfield, but the institutional indifference of a man who regarded the people he owned as labor rather than as objects of personal interest. In Mississippi in 1853, that was the closest thing to safety available. Samuel was 13 when we left the Whitfield property. He never asked me directly what I had done. Not that year, not in the years after, not once in all the time we had together. There is a conversation we did not have that I have had with myself in every form it could take, and I still do not know whether his silence was the silence of a child who did not want to know, or the silence of a child who already knew and had decided that not naming it was how he would let his mother keep what she had done as her own. I was freed by the 13th Amendment in 1865. I was 55 years old. I had spent 55 years belonging to other people, and I was given my freedom in a document signed by men I had never met, deciding to return something they never had the right to take. And the world I was freed into was a world built entirely without provision for what I would do next or how I would survive doing it. I settled in Port Gibson. Samuel was there already. He had come ahead, made arrangements, built the beginning of something in that small city along the river that he could offer me as a place to arrive. He had grown into a quiet man, capable and self-contained, with the specific gravity of someone who has decided that most of what there is to say is better kept inside. He used my name as his surname, Samuel Cora, the reconstruction of identity through naming that many freed people chose in those years, the insistence on lineage and connection in a country that had spent 2 centuries trying to sever both. I taught in Port Gibson, though no one would have called it that. I cooked in several households, and in those kitchens I passed to younger women what ISIS had passed to me. Not the most specific of it, not the knowledge that had ended 4 men in Natchez and Sunflower County, but the foundation underneath it, the observation, the patience, the understanding that what grows in dark soil and what happens to matter over time is not superstition, not ritual, not the invention of frightened white men who needed African knowledge to be mysterious so they could keep fearing it in the wrong direction. It was science. It was accumulated and transmitted and carried in the heads of women who had no other place to carry it, across an ocean and across generations, arriving intact in the hands of whoever came next. I remember one evening in particular, a young woman named Ruth who was maybe 19 years old, stirring a pot with the distracted look of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. I watched her for a moment and then I said, "Pay attention to what's in front of you." Not because I was correcting her technique, because I was giving her the only thing ISIS had ever asked of me. Full attention, without flinching, to whatever is actually there. Ruth looked up at me. She didn't understand what I meant yet. She would. I died in September of 1871. The record says age advanced. The record says survived by 1 son. The record does not say what I cooked. The record does not say what I knew or where the knowledge came from or the name of the woman who gave it to me, standing in the summer heat, showing me what dark soil keeps and what it gives and what it does when you learn to ask it the right questions. The record does not say what happened at the Whitfield table on the 15th of October 1851. It does not say who was sitting in the wooden chair in the corner of a room on the morning of November 13th, or what that woman's face looked like in the moment between the last breath and the calling of the housemaid. What I will tell you is what that moment was. It was not triumph. Triumph is loud, and I had not been loud in 41 years. It was not relief. Relief implies that a weight has been lifted, and the weight I was carrying was not the kind that a death resolves. The weight that Samuel carried in his eyes when he would not look directly at me across a room was still there, would still be there in Port Gibson, would still be in the grain of his face the last time I looked at him and did not know it was the last time. What it was, in that chair, in that room, in that silence after the breathing stopped, was something closer to the moment after you have carried something the correct distance and set it down in the place where it needed to be set down. Not relief that it is down, just the fact of it being down. The weight still in the memory of the hands still knowing what it cost to carry it, but the floor beneath your feet, and the door ahead of you. And outside that door, The morning air that was always there even when you were carrying the thing and could not feel it. I got up from the chair. I went to the window. I called the housemaid's name. That is the whole of it. That is every bit of what it was. If you were expecting something larger, I am telling you now that this is the exact scale of what justice looks like when you build it yourself from the only materials the world has left within your reach. It does not look like the justice in books. It does not look like any justice designed by anyone who had power over the shape of things. It looks like a woman in a wooden chair in the grey light of a November morning in Mississippi, rising, crossing the room, opening a window, speaking a name. That is what I have. That is all I ever had. And it was enough.